Aloha! We are representing the University of Hawaii at Manoa and are supported by the National Science Foundation. For the 9th International Conference on Global Health Challenges, our topic is Pandemics in Hawaii, 1918 Influenza and COVID-19.
These are our team members. Since our team is growing with a large number, not everyone is in this picture, but their names are surely mentioned here. Oahu in Hawaii and Nice in France are basically antithetical to each other. Despite the distance, as everyone else around the world, we were taken by surprise with this global pandemic and we're struggling to address this challenge. Before going more in depth into the subject, let us take a little tour. This is the island of Oahu, the most populated among the 8 beautiful islands of Hawaii. In Oahu, here lies our campus, the University of Hawaii at Manoa.
Hi, I'm math undergraduate Helen Tong, and I will be talking about the history of some of the pandemics in Hawaii. I'd like to begin by describing the special nature of looking at Hawaii and its background with diseases. Much like when America was first discovered by Europeans, Hawaii was a very susceptible place upon arrival from Westerners. Even despite attempts from captains to dissuade sailors from staying too close to the natives, as this is far from the first new land, complications led to the sailors staying on the islands for longer than expected. Though, in the present time, Hawaii's population has caught up with the globe. However, Hawaii still has an older demographic, with many retired and elderly, a demographic that tends to be more susceptible to disease. And finally, the geographic location of Hawaii gives it the unique ability to close off its borders completely, as arrival to the island is usually by plane. Now to introduce our first pandemic, the 1918 Influenza Pandemic, this is typically misnomered as the Spanish flu, but I'll avoid using that term here. Anyways, the 1918 pandemic killed 21 million people globally, 675,000 Americans, and 2,300 people in Hawaii. It swept through Hawaii in 2 waves, with the second being more devastating than the first. Additionally, health facilities and communities faced problems, while officials pushed against closure. As for a brief timeline and background of this pandemic, the era it occurred in is quite notable. At this time, World War I had already begun for the United States. At this point, not many details on the virus's spread was recorded. Reasonable, since a war was going on. As the war begins to end and the flu is recognized to have spread and devastated, a pandemic response really ramps up. Data from this past century is difficult to come by, especially for the territory of Hawaii. Because of that, morbidity for influenza exhibits weak statistics, being a late statistic and missing pneumonia. Additionally, Hawaii was not added to the US death registration area for a while. As a result of these things, we mostly worked with Hawaii's mortality data when looking back to the 1918 pandemic. On the left, we can see the death rate per capita for Hawaii and the rest of the recorded US during the 1918 pandemic. Notably, Hawaii seems to exhibit a lag behind the continental US. On the right is simply the deaths across 3 years of the 1918 pandemic. Here we notice the wave behavior of the virus, where it is strongest in the last wave. Viewing age, sex, and race statistics, we noticed a few things. The 1918 influenza seemed to target young children under 5, and less so target children between 5 and 19. Looking between the sexes, the ratio stays mostly constant, with the target on males. Seeing race, flu deaths appear to target Japanese the strongest. We take a 100-year step forward into today and see ourselves at a COVID-19 pandemic. Now, life is in color, and also very different. COVID-19 in Hawaii breaks down quite simply. As of September 22nd, we have 11,522 cases, where 749 were hospitalizations and 120 were deaths. And with this, the death rate is approximately 1.04%. Taking a quick look at race data, Pacific Islanders were most affected, despite their low population percentage. Here, we take a quick look into the age, sex, and race data. We'll dive further into this in the later slides, but note that more details on these statistics can be found from the DOH and other public sources. Here, we look at the epidemic curve and death curves for COVID-19 between Hawaii and the United States. In particular, we see that Hawaii's curve exhibits similar waves to that of the US. We also notice that Hawaii has a lower death rate than the national average. So, good job. It should be noted that the data collected for the United States also contains Hawaii data. Looking at the timeline for events surrounding Hawaii's COVID-19 pandemic, we see a much busier timeline. This is unhelpful to the public, as regulations and expectations were slowly learned by the general public. Regardless, we note that the significant event is a stay-at-home order, beginning May 5th and ending May 31st. Now we begin looking into comparing the 1918 influenza pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic in Hawaii. There's something to mention first. Comparison between two pandemics before one has even ended may be too hasty. Further, the 1918 pandemic gives little statistics to even work with. Despite this, conclusions can still be drawn, and we continue pushing forward. Taking a quick comparison, both pandemics share the wave behavior. We see it in the death rate for the 1918 pandemic and the epicurve for the COVID-19 pandemic. We also notice that both viruses tend to target males in terms of mortality. In their differences locally, different races were the larger target for both pandemics. Japanese and Native Hawaiians for the 1918 pandemic, and Pacific Islanders for the COVID-19 pandemic. We note that the working labor class is the most affected by mortality in both cases. Looking at age statistics, the two viruses seem to target different age demographics. The 1918 influenza targeted individuals under 5, while COVID-19 targets individuals over 60, young versus old. We've compared the 1918 pandemic and COVID-19, but how about just a regular flu season? When COVID-19 began ramping up, many doubted its danger, saying it was just another flu. Now we know differently, but let's see what's really different. We aim to compare and contrast COVID-19 with the normal flu season. Here we take 2018 and 2019 season as our regular. We also like to understand the effect of COVID-19's pandemic on the flu season it intersected with, 2019 to 2020. Looking at the weekly cases, we see that this year's flu began looking similar to last season's. However, once the COVID-19 pandemic began, the stay-at-home order was announced, the flu and COVID-19 cases began to plummet. Most importantly from this graph, we recognize that after the stay-at-home order, it destroyed the flu and it stayed at a constant 0, or more or less 0, but not COVID-19. Looking at Hawaii's positivity rate for each virus, we noticed that immediately before the stay-at-home order, the flu was much more negatively reported than usual. We suppose that this occurred for two reasons. More testing means more asymptomatic people got tested, either for flu or for COVID, and additionally, people with the flu symptoms may have mistaken it for COVID-19 and only got tested for COVID-19. Viewing weekly test counts for each of the both flus, we see that testing was up immediately before the stay-at-home order. This is likely because avoiding the flu was greatly encouraged by officials to avoid mixing up the symptoms once the pandemic started. Additionally, we see that testing was down during and after the stay-at-home order. The reason for this is unknown, but we speculate that individuals may have feared getting tested at this point. Seeing weekly deaths, we see a very largely important takeaway. Ultimately, COVID-19 is more dangerous to people than the flu. It has taken more lives and it demands a stronger response. Aside from that, the flu does not act differently from our control from the regular flu. Both begin to decrease in deaths around April. Moving forward, we recognize that it will be better to draw conclusions when the pandemic ultimately finishes, however far that is. However, we already see some important similarities and differences worth noting, and we'd like to continue with this. Looking towards the future, a new flu season is set to begin for Hawaii, and tourism is also looking to open back up again. In this case, influenza might not be addressed over COVID-19, as we'll be more worried about COVID-19, and we look to prevent or recognize the effects of this, as we might not be looking as harshly at influenza now.